Alrighty, everybody. It is currently Sunday, January 4th, 2025, and I'm coming at you live from the land of ice. I don't know. This is a culture like double feature type episode. We're going to be going over two cultures that I don't know, or like people, cultures, whatever, that people really don't know too much about. We're going to be going over a little bit of history of each group and then a little bit of like their cultural practices and what makes them so unique. These both are technically indigenous cultures, but like I don't like you look up indigenous cultures and it's never like England or whatever. And I guess that kind of makes sense, but in the sense that like English culture has been so like influenced by outside cultures and stuff, but it's like that's kind of true of every culture. Like really the word indigenous kind of means whatever culture was there before like the 1400s or whatever, or like 1500s. Like that's typically what indigenous means, because if you think about it, kind of no one's indigenous, right? uh really, except the Aboriginal Australians. But even then there's a little bit of iffiness there of what's exactly going on. So these both are technically indigenous quote unquote cultures. I guess just like non-westernized. I don't even know what that means. But then again, like the Japanese aren't considered indigenous, right? Because of like the Aino and the Hokkaido. Is that what the other? I can't remember what the other group was called. No, Hokkaido was the island. Um, yeah. So I don't really know like what indigenous. I know like in the general cultural zeitgeist, indigenous is just whoever the fuck was there before like the Europeans showed up, right? Like that's what they say about the Aztecs. They're like the Aztecs were they were the indigenous people, and it's like no, they were an empire who like conquered and enslaved thousands, if not like millions of people. They were so I don't know what makes them indigenous. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know exactly how it works, but these are kind of what you would typically think of when you think of like indigenous cultures, talking to moon spirits and shit like that. Um, but we did get a new follower on Spotify, up to 22. You know, and Vincent, friend of the show, Vincent, said that I need to check my ego and leave it at the door. I'm God. All right. No, okay. I got I still have a little bit. I'm not Christian anymore, but I still have a little bit of that superstition about me where I got to clear that up a little bit. No, I'm not actually God, but yeah, new follower on Spotify, sweet. We have had a couple new subscribers on YouTube, also pretty sweet. So forgot to shout out all those people, but here it is. Shout out all those people. Um, and I think this episode will prove that I'm not God. If the dumb words that have spilled out of my mouth haven't already proved that. But I think I bit off a little bit more than I could chew for this one, going with a double feature. But I couldn't. There just wasn't enough information about these two groups, because I went like small, like groups that most people at least have never even heard of before. So I tried to do that for these two groups, and they're kind of like bordering on between I could get enough like fun information for a full video, and then like kind of not really. So bit off a little bit more than I could chew. It's a little bit sporadic, the information I'm going to be giving. Kind of, I don't know. We're going to be jumping back and forth a lot. But look, that shouldn't be. I feel like some of the recent episodes have been a little bit more narrative based. Anyone who's listened to any of the older ones knows this is a jumping around type of show. You know what I mean? This is a kangaroo jumping around type of show. Um, and so yeah, the two groups we're going to be going over today are the Selk'nam. I don't know it Selk apostrophe Nam, and then we're also going to be going over the Seto. One's from South America and one's from like the Baltic kind of region of Europe, kind of Slavic Baltic. I don't fucking know. Um, yeah, and so those are the two groups we're going to be going over today. Like I said, double feature. I remembered a lot of information about like what I read and listened to and stuff like that, and so I'll try to throw that in where it's appropriate. But sometimes I'll get to the end of this is probably what's gonna happen. I'll get to the end of the section about the indigenous people, whichever group it is, and then I'll be like, "Oh, I forgot to say. Oh, I forgot to say." So that's probably what's gonna happen. But either way, these are pretty interesting, pretty unique groups of people. Not too unique. Damn. Uh, but yeah, pretty interesting, pretty isolated groups of people. They manage to isolate themselves in a lot of ways, um, whether it's geographically or through other means. Um, Very different stories for both of these people. You know what I mean, in terms of their long-term survival of the people and also the culture and all those things. So the Selk'nam, spoiler alert, their story is a little bit more depressing. The Seto, however you want to say it, they got off a little bit easier. Still got a little bit fucked, but not as bad as these people got fucked. So kind of a sad story, sadder story. You know what I mean? Times change. It just is what happens. Second story, a little bit more. They also get fucked. Any small group of people, whether they're technologically advanced or not, they end up getting fucked up. You know what I mean? Most groups have had like a little bit of genocide done against them. Just a little bit, just a little sprinkle. As we'll find out in this episode, some more than others. Some got it a little bit worse than others. Um, and so, yeah, we'll get into our first group here with the Selk'nam. I'd say that's the closest approximation to how you pronounce it. I don't know if this is like the indigenous name for them, like if it's their own language they're called the Selk'nam, or if it was like the Spanish name for them, because these people they're from like the Latin America type territory. They're very interesting. Probably not what you're expecting. So the Selk'nam were/are, it's kind of iffy. Were/are a collection of peoples native to the Tierra del Fuego archipelago in Argentina/Chile. And so if you don't know, this is like the very like tip of South America. That's where these people hang out, or used to hang out. As we're gonna find out, not anymore. They're not chilling there anymore. Um, and so yeah, they're from that kind of region, and that's where I did an episode about Magellan, and he took like multiple ships, I guess, and one of the ships, or maybe it was like one of like the little boats that they have on like the big ships. One of those ships ended up like crashing around this area, and they ended up munching penguins. Now the Selknam, they're a little bit farther north. They're not at the very tip. They're a little bit farther north. They're not munching as many penguins. There is some sources talking about dudes munching a lot of birds, but it doesn't specify what type of bird. I don't know if they were munching penguin or albatross or what other type of birds. Is that the place where they have like the rheas? A rhea is like kind of like it's kind of like a bitch version of an ostrich. I know they're from South America, but I don't know if they hang out in the Tierra del Fuego. In the Tierra del Fuego, it is really far south, but it doesn't. It's a little bit more like Londony. You know what I mean? Or like England or Ireland or Scotland or one of a little bit more European. Like Europe as a whole doesn't really get too cold, and that's just because it's like this long, pretty small. It goes more lengthwise than it does height wise. Sorry. Um, and so it kind of like the whole continent, not the whole continent, but most of the continent has like a temperate climate zone, even when it's like super far north because of like the weather and shit like that. And I think that's kind of true of this area as well. Like they have like warm air coming off the Pacific or some shit like that, because these dudes weren't like full Eskimo or anything like that. Like they were, yeah, but they weren't full Eskimo. We'll find out later. So the early Selknam were hunters, and it is believed that at one point they also held territory on the mainland of Chile, but that was like a while ago. You know what I mean? It wasn't like when the Europeans showed up, and they got hit a couple times by the Europeans. They got hit a couple times. But it's not like the Europeans showed up and like kind of pushed them to the Tierra del Fuego islands. They they had that shit a while ago, and then they were like, "Nah, we're going to island time. We're going to the Sandals Resort. We're going to Jamaica or whatever." They kind of decided that on their own, or they were pushed out by another group. But not a lot of people down there. Even now, there's not a ton of people down there. It's pretty untamed wilderness. Like I think now a lot of national parks of like Chile and Argentina are down there. Not because it's like completely inhospitable. Like I said, these people, it was pretty chill down there. The cold wasn't as extreme as you might think it is. I mean, that motherfucker's like right next to Antarctica. Like these boys were like a step away from hopping down to Antarctica. Like that's how far south they are. But the weather's not that extreme. It's just I guess no one wants to live down there. And maybe some other things about it make it hard to develop. Like I think it's like pretty rocky and like mountainous and stuff like that where these dudes are hanging at. And even like on to the actual mainland, it's pretty I think like it goes islands and then there's just like a mountain range. So I think probably that's why no one lives down there. It's way too fucking mountainous for people to like large groups of people like cities and shit to be built down there. But luckily these dudes didn't need cities. They were chill with doing whatever. So from the beginning, they had hostile relationships with the Europeans. When Olivier van Noort arrived in 1599 and slaughtered 40 Selk'nam. Uh, we don't really have a clear, or I couldn't find, like a really clear number on pre-European contact numbers. I'm sure a lot of them got wiped out by disease and stuff like that, but these boys got hit with a little bit more than this. They got hit. This isn't the only example of them getting hit by a little bit more than disease. Um, and so as we're gonna find out, when I said they were slash are, we're gonna be talking about kind of what that means nowadays. But they did get slaughtered. I don't know if this was their first contact with Europeans. Like I said, Magellan was down there when he sailed around the world. He at some point he was in Tierra del Fuego, but this is on like the Pacific side of the kind of the tip of South America. It's not on the Atlantic side. It's on the Pacific side. So I don't know if Magellan was. I'm trying to remember the exact route he took. Yeah, I don't think he was around there. I think he kind of like it was there and then he made like a straight shot like upwards and then he went through like Polynesia and the Philippines and shit like that. So I don't know if Magellan ever ran into these boys. Magellan was eh he wasn't that bad. He was a little bit more of like a crusader, maybe I'll say. Like he didn't just want to like wipe out the indigenous or whatever. He was like, if you guys convert to Christianity, then like I'll leave you alone. That was kind of Magellan's whole thing. Um, we're not exactly clear on what happened with Olivier van Noort. He was a Dutch dude, um, and the Dutch they weren't big on like wiping out all the people, you know. But I do think that they were pretty big on like enslavement. I think the Dutch were pretty big when it came to slaves, like enslaving the local population, not like bringing in slaves, but enslaving the local population. I think that was kind of the Dutch people. That was their MO when they would colonize places and shit like that. So I guess a little bit out of the norm, you could say. But once again, these are like early European colonists. So I would say this is also within the norm. It's just not typically what you think of when you think of Dutch colonization. You think of just like mass enslavement and like plantations and stuff like that. But the Dutch, they didn't end up colonizing this place, but the Dutch colonially do seem to have like a fascination with like the tips of continents. You know what I mean? Like South Africa, that's like a Dutch, that was like a Dutch colony for a while there. So they seem big into tips, dude. The Dutch love the tips of continents. It's where they love hanging out. So that's in 1599. And then in 1769, James Cook, this guy's probably one of the most famous British explorers. I think he got Australia and Hawaii and probably a whole fucking bunch of other places. He also fucking got these guys too. He wasn't the first European there, but he was kind of one of the first. Like they didn't have much contact with the Europeans. Like I said, this is an area that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to colonize. Like it's you could do shit there and people do shit there. But in terms of like what the Europeans wanted out of their colonies, this area didn't really provide them with. You can't like make a plantation for like cotton or sugar. There's no like gold or silver or anything like that, and so they didn't really have much incentive to colonize it. I think it's also pretty hard to make like a port there and stuff like that. And people just like avoid that area as a whole, right? Like whatever it's called between Antarctica and the tip of Chile. I think that's the Strait of Magellan or like the Cape of, I don't know, it's the Cape of something. Um, Whatever that is, that's very hard to sail through as we kind of found out in the Magellan episode. Like even that boy had a rough time getting through there. And so they didn't have much contact with Europeans really until the late 19th century. But anyway, so in 1769, James Cook wrote that the Selk'nam used glass for arrowheads, which he believed came from Louis Antoine de Bougainville. If you weren't there for that one, we did this episode about this island autonomous island region that wants to become its own country. They fought a whole war that was all over like a copper mine, basically. So I didn't know Bougainville got all the way down there because modern day Bougainville, it's what the autonomous region is called that wants to become its own country. They're up near Papua New Guinea, like Australia, like north of Australia type shit. So I don't know. I didn't know that our boy Bougainville made it all the way down there. And when you think of, because this dude was French, and when you think of like French colonization, at least when I think of it, I don't think of them as like cold weather colonists. I feel like they're trying to get more of a tropical getaway. You know what I mean? Like I said, they're trying to go to Jamaica. They're trying to drink a bunch of strawberry daiquiris or whatever. I think of them as a little bit more of warm weather colonists. Especially at this point, especially a little bit later on. I guess they did have Quebec for a little bit, um, but yeah. Other than that, they weren't really cold weather colonists. That was a little bit more of like an English type of thing to colonize areas with colder weather. And so, pretty sick that our boy Bougainville made it down there, though. Shout out to that guy. Nice little cameo from him. I didn't know if we were going to see him again or not, but we did. And he was in Tierra del Fuego. And this isn't 100% like confirmed for a fact that the glass came from Antoine de Bougainville. It could have been like obsidian or some shit like that. Like, I think probably part of the reason they call it Tierra del Fuego is because of probably like some volcanic activity in the region, right? Like Iceland or whatever. And so it could have been like obsidian or some shit, and James Cook just didn't know what obsidian was, but maybe he did, and maybe this glass was from Antoine de Bougainville, who made it down there. And so, like I said, they had very little contact with the outside world, just as a whole, right? Like they communicated with like some of the other local tribes and shit like that, but they were mostly isolated. Remember, they live on like an archipelago, which, if you don't know, an archipelago is like a collection of islands or whatever that I don't know if they have to share something in common, like geographically, like if they have to be part of the same geographic feature, if that makes sense. But like Hawaii, that's an archipelago. The Philippines, that's an archipelago. Indonesia, I think there's a few archipelagos in Indonesia. And so these dudes are living in some of these islands. It's kind of hard to tell like which one's an island and which one isn't because they're so close to the coast and stuff like that. But they're pretty isolated wherever they're at. And so they're pretty isolated until European shepherds arrived in the late 19th century. So this is like late, literally, they have like photographs of these people living how they lived, like completely traditionally, basically. It wasn't like in North America where it's like, yeah, the Apache didn't get conquered until, you know, what would that be? Like the late 1800s, early 1900s, around that. Um, but the Apache, they still had like pretty strong influences from the American settlers and stuff like that, and the Spanish and stuff. So they had like guns and horses and all that bullshit. The extent that these guys had in terms of their culture and way of life being influenced by the outside world was literally, like I said, those glass arrowheads that James Cook believed came from Louis Antoine de Bougainville. And so they were literally like almost how we talked about like the Aboriginals in terms of isolation, not in terms of a lot of other things. The Aboriginals are pretty unique, and I'm talking about the Australian Aboriginals, are pretty unique in terms of their culture and shit, but in terms of isolation, these guys are kind of on par with the other groups because the Aboriginals did have um contact with the outside world, but it was very minimal, right? They did trade a little bit with Indonesian sea cucumber fishermen. The Aboriginals did. Um, and that's kind of similar to what the Selk'nam did in terms of trading the glass with Bougainville. And so, yeah, these European shepherds arrive in the late 19th century, so like 1880s, I think, is when they showed up. It was not good. So the Selk'nam viewed the sheep that these shepherds brought as game and hunted them. And in return, the farmers hired mercenaries who genocided effectively all the Selk'nam. The last, like, quote unquote, pure blood Selk'nam who's like no like ancestry from Europe or like other, you know what I mean, like Latin American groups and stuff like that. The last one of those people died in like the 1970s. And so these people, the and that's kind of the reason I say they were slash are. It's because it's mostly like a cultural thing to me. Like, yeah, sure, the genetic lineage survived, but a lot of the culture was pretty effectively wiped out by this genocide. Like, even the people who didn't get killed by these mercenaries, they dipped immediately. And if I remember correctly, I think they're mostly in Argentina, which that makes sense just because Argentina's just has more area down there geographically. Um, and there's also 11 in the United States, which is pretty fun. Actually, no, there's about 3,000 in Argentina and about 1,200 in Chile. So no, they're pretty evenly split up. I guess with 11 in America too, which is pretty fun. And so in 1881, Salesian missionaries, which the Salesians were Italians, I guess, but I think these missionaries were Spanish, or that's how the Salesians started. They originally started as like helping young wayward men, which I mean, the Catholic Church helping young wayward men. Got some questions about that. You know what I mean? Got a few questions about that. But these dudes were Spanish, and they began efforts to protect the Selk'nam and their culture. And one missionary, Father Jose Maria Bovier, I guess is how you would say his name, compiled a dictionary of 4,000 words and 1,400 sentences and phrases. Uh, None of the people speak Selk'nam anymore. I'm sure there's a couple of them that speak the language out there, but effectively the language is extinct. It's not like the native people up in, you know, the Amazon type of region where a lot of their native languages still hold on, even if they've become, you know what I mean, like kind of a Creole language with Spanish or whatever. Like, this language is effectively extinct. You know what I mean? Like, when an animal is effectively extinct, it means that it only exists in captivity and things like that. That's what it means when an animal is effectively extinct. And so I would kind of say that same thing about this language. Like, no one's speaking it in their day to day life, which that's kind of true of a lot of Native American languages, like North American Native. Um, like, there are some, like especially Navajo, that still speak the language in day to day life, but most of the other ones are gone. Yupik and Inuit, they also kind of speak the language in day to day life, but Selk'nam is not like that at all. Like, if anyone's speaking Selk'nam, they learned it because they wanted to learn it. You know what I mean? There was no one was passing it down through the family or anything like that. But this guy, they wanted to protect the natives. I guess they showed up around the same time as the shepherds, so they probably saw these people get effectively hunted to extinction. And he spent from, I think it was from 1881 until 1924. So how many years is that? Is that 43 years? I don't know, something like that. He spent like all that time traveling around like Tierra del Fuego, specifically where the Selk'nam were hanging out, so that he could try to not get them like hunted down and killed. I think he thought if he could like convert them over to the Western way of living, then he could prevent them from dying, which is pretty true. But he wasn't just interested in that; he was also interested in preserving their culture. and stuff like that. So eth- ethnographers, sorry, early ethnographers described the group as giants, with the average height being nearly 6 feet, and they dressed sparingly despite the bitter climate. So yeah, you can Google image the Selk'nam people. They're kind of like, they don't wear clothes like that. Like yeah, they have like stuff on, but I wouldn't call it clothes. Like they're not rocking like moccasins or even like fucking grass skirts or whatever, or even like loincloths. They're literally just like wrapping themselves in hides, which yeah, I, they're pretty like they have made other advancements and stuff like that. They're not super technologically advanced. They live in a pretty a pretty inhospitable region, but they just like never stumbled onto clothes like that. Like they only wear hides. And like I said, it was the late 1800s when really they started having significant contact with the outside world. And so we have pictures of like probably what they dressed like throughout their whole history. Yeah, they're just wearing like it's almost like a blanket. Yeah, they're just wearing it like a blanket, which is pretty fucking sick, dude. Just a bunch of giants wearing fucking hide blankets all the time. It seems like some of them are wearing hats. I think looks like the dudes wear hats and the chicks don't wear hats. But I guess most of the time, then, like when you're hunting, you gotta take that bitch off so you can shoot the arrow. So they were probably hunting butt ass naked, dude. Just butt ass full tennis. The tennis must have been absurd, you know. And I will say they do have some. I don't know if I would call it tennis culture in there, but they do have a little bit of like a little bit of. They need to prove their masculinity. I'll say. I'll say that much. But yeah, they were basically just like, and everyone, it like no one was wearing clothes like that. Like they would just wrap themselves in a hide and a little fur hat, which I don't know. I think that's pretty. It's pretty fucking sick, dude. They're all giants and they're all just wearing hides and shit like that. Like I feel like this is where like some myths could come from. You know what I mean? Like another like some other group from South America, some other like indigenous group, or even Europeans. Like Europeans still had myths at the time. Like traveled down to see just like these fucking huge, and this is 6 feet. And I guess this is I don't remember when this ethnographer dude lived. I think he was German, but I don't remember exactly when he lived. Yeah, German anthropologist. Oh, so he was also late 1800s, but still late 1800s, being 6 foot tall then, that's being like 6'5" now. So they were all 6'5", and they were all jacked. You can look up pictures of these people. They were some pretty beefy individuals. Definitely not what you think of when you think of like South American native or indigenous people. You typically think of like smaller, like rainforest or mountain type people, but these people were fucking. They were huge, and they were just running around in hides and shit like that, and they were hunting. That's basically all they did. Um, there's a lot of grass down there, and I guess that's why the shepherds thought it was a good place to set up shop and then kill all the native people. There's a lot of grass, but there's not a whole ton of other sources of food. You know what I mean? It's pretty hard to grow anything there besides what already grows there, which is mostly grass and I'm sure a tree here or there. And so the diet of the Selknam was almost entirely meat, specifically the guanaco, which acted as their buffalo, and they also used domesticated Kulepo foxes for hunting and heat. And so these people had domesticated foxes. It was called the Europeans called them like the dog of fuego, however you say that in Spanish, perro de fuego, some shit like that. But yeah, these were foxes that these people had domesticated to help them hunt. I don't know exactly how they used the foxes to hunt because these guanaco things, if you don't know, it's basically like a shrunken down llama. Uh, and they live. I guess they're fucking abundant there. And like I said, these were their buffalo. They made like their clothes, the hides that I was saying they were wearing. They were guanaco hides. They made their houses out of the guanaco. Um, they ate mostly guanaco meat. I'm sure they used their bones for tools and shit like that. So that's what I mean when I say that these animals were basically their buffalo or cows. I guess cows are the cornerstone of a lot of people's diets and ways of life and stuff like that. So buffalo, cow, whatever your specific group depends on, that's what these were for these guys. And they were munching them and all that stuff. And the Calippo foxes, so this German ethnographer guy, he talked about how they used them for heat because they would bring them into the tents, but then they wouldn't just like sleep in the tent with the person. They would like hug that bitch. Like they were keeping that bitch close because like I said, it's not as bitterly cold as you might think. Like it's not northern Scandinavia or anything like that, but it does get, no mistake, make no mistake, it does get pretty chilly down there, but it's not, you know what I mean, the fucking Yukon or whatever, where it just turns into a frozen wasteland for like 7 months out of the year or whatever. And so they use them for hunting and heat. Like I said, I don't know specifically what they use them for hunting, because these are foxes and these guanaco things, like I said, kind of shrunken down version of a llama, but there's no way these little foxes are taking those guys down. So maybe they use them to like track the scent or to like push them into specific areas. But these guys did have domesticated foxes, which is it's pretty sick, pretty unique. Yeah, so that's pretty cool that they use for hunting and heat. So the most well known part of Selk'nam culture, there's not a whole lot that's well known about these people, but the most well known part of the culture was the Hain, Hain, however you say that, which was their male initiation ceremony, where older men would dress up in masks and attack the young men. So yeah, I guess just randomly, these dudes would just put on masks and attack these kids. The masks aren't, they're supposed to look like spirits, and the spirits were like spirits that the kids had heard about their whole lives, and so they would put on these masks and then they would paint themselves to look like these spirits, and they would pull up on them young boys, just like the Salesian missionaries. They would pull up on these young boys, and I don't know how hard they attacked them. I don't know if they were like beating the shit out of them or if it was a little bit more of just like a spook. Like if they were just going up and being like, "Ah," I don't know which one it was, but they would in some way attack them. And it was a little bit more of like a straight up like intimidation thing, because these spirits were supposed to be like bad spirits and stuff that these kids believed in. And so uh, these masks resembled spirits, like I said, and the young men would remove the masks and be told the world creation story. Uh, doesn't really go into detail about the world creation story. It has something to do with the moon and sun. I'm sure it's maybe our boy, what was the guy's name? Father Jose Maria Bovier. Maybe he got a little bit of information about these stories, but I do think that they're probably like the actual story is effectively dead. We know it has something to do with the sun and the moon, and somehow that made the Earth. But yeah, they not really a whole lot else is known about these stories. There is another story that we're going to talk about, which does have a little bit of Teenus culture. So another story would be told where in days past the women dressed up as spirits to control the men, and when the men found out, they dressed up as spirits to threaten the women. And they say that the young women never learned or were never told that these dudes in masks were spirits, right? And so it was supposed to be that the women never knew, but they definitely fucking knew, right? Like these, I assume that the dudes lived with their wives, right? Just like most other people in the world. And so I'm sure one of these bitches saw like a dude putting on like a bark mask and painting himself with white paint and then heading out to scare these boys, and she put two and two together and she fucking, you know what I mean? Women, am I right? Went and yapped and told all the other I'm sure they knew. Right? Like it's pretty crazy. I think the women are still controlling the men at this point, because if the men legitimately believe that none of the women ever figure out that these spirits are the men, that they gotta be retarded. You know what I mean? They gotta be legitimately retarded. And these are big giant dudes who just fucking eat llama meat all day, so maybe they are retarded. But the women definitely knew that these dudes were spirits. Maybe not when they were young, but as they got older, they definitely figured it out. Like, yeah, all the grown men like disappear on this one specific. Hit the sneeze there. All the dudes disappear on this one specific night when the spirits come to attack. Like, Yeah, I figured it. I figured it out. And so I do say that this is like a little bit of a teenage cultural practice where they're like, dude, we have fucking tiny ass dicks because we don't wear clothes when we go hunting. So we got to prove to the women how big and strong we are by dressing up as spirits and shit like that. And so that's their most well known tradition, and that was like the main thing. They also did like the like pain rites of passage, which I don't know what that means. I don't know if it was like the Amazon where they put your hand in a glove that's full of bullet ants, or if it was like scarification, or if they just like beat the shit out of you. I really don't know what those pain initiation stories are, but they did something like that too. And these Haines, whatever you want to call them, they could last up to a year. And they brought together Selk'nam from all over, and young men would also learn about their skills and responsibilities. So that's the end of the Selk'nam, and this is the part where I say, "Oh, I forgot to say, oh, I forgot." So let's get into that real quick. So the Hinds would basically, it wasn't like on a set schedule, right? It wasn't like they would look up at the stars or like the phase that the moon was in, and they'd be like, "All right, it's time for a Hind," right? Or it would be like one kind of group of young boys has gotten to that age. No, when these things would happen is basically whenever there was an abundance of food. So one thing that was noted was like if a whale washed up on the beach, because these people I guess weren't going out and hunting whales. Like I said, these are very rough, choppy waters. It's pretty tough to get out there and kill whales, especially with the technology they had. So they would wait for a whale to wash up on the beach, and then, or I guess a bunch of llamas would show up and they'd be like, all right, it's time to do the hind. And they could last for a while. And like literally all the Selk'nam got together, and there was male camps and female camps, which once again, it's still kind of like, I'm pretty sure these bitches could fit, like, uh, that's, that's something that women are very good at. You know what I mean? They could figure that shit out, I feel like pretty quickly. And then another tradition was their marriage tradition. So it wasn't like arranged marriages or anything like that. I'm sure there was like a little touch of that, like there kind of is in a lot of old cultures, whether it's in Europe or Asia or wherever it is, there might have been like a little bit of arrangement. But for the most part, what would happen is, uh, if a dude wanted to marry a chick, he would make a bow and then he would present it to the woman, but he would have to do it in front of her familial elders. And so that was their marriage tradition. Pretty interesting, sick group of people. I always wondered who lived down there, and I always wondered if they were munching penguins. There is a few other groups who live, like these people, the Selk'nam, they live a little bit in like the north western island area of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. And so there were other groups that lived further south, a little bit more towards the tip, just the tip. So I wonder if they were munching penguins, because like I said, there was some people who said that the more southern living Selknam ate a lot of birds, but there's not a whole ton of evidence for that. There's a ton of evidence for them hunting mostly these guanacos, though. But I do wonder if some of the other more southern living groups around there munched on penguins. I don't know. The Selknam really didn't talk to them that much. The other groups, there was this one other group that they were kind of chill with, and they would talk to them every now and then, trade and shit like that. But they were pretty much isolated on their little islands up there, up in the northwestern part of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. So maybe these other dudes were munching penguins, and we just don't know about it. I remember that Magellan's dudes, when they got shipwrecked around the Tierra del Fuego area, they were munching a lot of penguins. And so I got to imagine, like, if that's the easiest food source to get down there, these other groups were probably munching at least a little bit of penguin. Maybe not a ton of penguin. You know what I mean? There's probably not a whole ton of meat on a penguin. It's probably mostly breast meat. Like a penguin is 90% breast. Like you look at a penguin and the way it's built and shit like that. Like there's no meat in that wing. They got tiny little stubby legs. I feel like a penguin is 90% breast. And then the other part's just like fat and organs and shit like that. So maybe they were munching penguins too. I don't know. They definitely were. I feel like a penguin is such an easy target, and they do live up there. Let me pull up a penguin map real quick. I'm pretty sure they go like most of the way up the coast of South America. Yeah, They go like all the way up there, so I'm sure they were munching a little bit of penguin. They were like, I'm getting sick and tired of guanaco. Send the foxes out there to grab us a few penguins to munch on, a few pengus. All right, so that was the Selk'nam. Like, never got the pronunciation of the name down, but to be fair, they don't even know the pronunciation because they got genocided. Ha ha. You can't correct me because you're all dead. No. All right. And now on to our second group, the Setos. So the Setos are an indigenous group of Finnic peoples who have historically lived on the borderlands between Russia and Estonia. So once again, a more northern group, but you got to remember this is Europe. They've got a lot of warm fucking air coming off the ocean and shit like that. So they're probably not even as cold as the Setos are. I'm sure their winters are pretty cold, but I think the rest of the year is pretty chill up around Estonia and shit like that. And they're Finnic, which this is where this whole fucking thing is a little bit confusing to me because they live up in the Baltic, like the Baltic type area, which that's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I think Poland is kind of included in that, but Polacks are Slavs. And then basically they're like these Finnish people or related to Finnish people, but they're surrounded by like Slavs and Baltic people and all that sort of shit. Although I do think the Estonians are Finnic. I don't think that they're considered Baltic. Maybe Baltic isn't even an ethnic thing. Maybe it's just a geographic thing. I don't fucking know. Right? Like I said, this is where it gets a little bit confusing to me, but they're Finnic. All right, just fucking remember that they're not Slavic. They're not, but they are pretty similar to the Russians in a lot of ways, actually. But I guess fucking genetically, they're a little bit more related to like the Finnish people. I don't know if Estonians are Finnic at all. But yeah, that's what they are, and they live up around that area. I was gonna Google if the Estonians are Finnic, but fuck it, doesn't matter at all, because their culture is super unique, and so it really doesn't matter what they are genetically, at least in my fucking opinion. And so in the 1200s, crusades led by the Teutonic Order into Estonia and Latvia caused most Estonians to become Catholic, while the Setos remained animistic, right? Animistic, meaning that they believe that everything has its own spirit and all that shit. Like shaman type shit, essentially. And they remained animistic within the Novgorod Republic. So I didn't know that the Catholics, they were trying to get everyone back then. Because you think of the Crusades as mostly the Catholic states, the Catholic countries in Europe, you know what I mean? The various orders of knights trying to retake the Holy Land and really any formerly Christian land that had been conquested by the Muslims. That's typically what you think of when you think of Crusades, but I guess they were trying to get everyone because they went into Estonia and Latvia. And so Estonia, it was majority Catholic for a while, but then they got taken over by like the Swedes, I think. And the Swedes made them all become Lutheran. So there's almost like no Catholic. There's like 5,000 Catholics left in Estonia. And then they got taken over by the Soviet Union. And so now it's a majority atheist country. And so they were majority Catholic for a while, and then they became mostly Lutheran, and then they became mostly atheist. So the Catholics are a very, very, there might be more Setos in Estonia than there are Catholics in Estonia at this point. But I don't know, I thought that was pretty interesting that in the Teutonic Knights, those guys were, I believe, German. I believe the Teutonic Knights were German. Those are the ones, I think a lot of the armor in like movies and shit, like knight armor is based off the Teutonic Knights. I think they were the ones who had like the helmets, like the kind of square bucket helmet that was just like two little slits in there. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's what those guys were. But they came up, and I don't know, maybe they got like a little bit fucked over in the Holy Land by like the big Muslim, caliphates or whatever, and they were like, we need an easy win. We need an easy win. Let's go make the Estonians Catholic. I feel like that's the easier task, than going and retaking the Holy Land from these big Muslim empires. And so I guess most of the people up in Estonia were like still shamanistic, animistic, whatever you want to call it, during that time. And so over the next 200 years, the Setos would slowly adopt uh, Christian orthodoxy and incorporate their pre-Christian beliefs into it. So yeah, they're just so close to Russia, and the Novgorod Republic, whatever the fuck it was called, Novgorod, I don't fucking remember. That was like a, I guess, a republic that was mostly up in Russia and stuff like that. So these guys were pretty heavily influenced by Russia and the Slavs and all that stuff. Like, I don't really know that much about traditional Finnic culture, but a lot of this shit does seem a lot more Slavic to me. Culturally, at least, they seem a lot more Slavic. They're Orthodox, like the clothes they wear and stuff like that seem very Slavic to me. But like I said, I don't know shit about Finnic culture. Maybe Finnic culture is super similar to Slavic culture, but at the very least, these guys in their specific religion that they kind of created uh, was heavily influenced by the Slavs. And so they kind of incorporated a lot of their animistic pre-Christian beliefs into that Orthodox Christianity. And so when Estonia became independent in 1905, the government attempted to Estonify the Setos, but due to their rural nature and proximity to Russia, this mostly failed. So I guess they were ruled by Sweden and shit for a little bit, um, and then they became independent. And I'm sure they were also fucking like ruled by Russia or something, because Russia was wilding out back then. Still kind of wilding. Russia's still wilding out a little bit, trying to conquer land and shit. But Estonia does become independent in 1905. They're technically independent at this point, but there's still not a lot of beef with Russia, but there's a little bit of beef with Russia. But Estonia basically becomes independent and then immediately is like, all right, we got to make everyone in the country Estonian. And it's like, dude, you've been a country for like 5 fucking minutes now. Take a break. You got a lot of other shit to figure out before you try to make everyone Estonian first. You know what I mean? Like, you got some other shit to deal with before you, I mean, and it's like, the word Estonify is pretty pathetic. Like, if you got if your culture got Estonified, that one's on you. You know, like, that's completely your fault. Like, if you get anglicized, okay, that's one thing. You know, the British were the most powerful empire of the time. Or if you got like Sovietized, okay, maybe that's one thing. But if you got Estonified, dude, you got the fucking Estonia was the country that fucked you. That's completely on you. You know, you're completely to blame for that one. But like I said, these people were able to avoid Estonification. They lived in a very remote place, but they also had like a village set up. Like, they weren't all in one big city or village or something like that. They had like a ton of different villages that were around these borderlands that are mostly like woods and lakes and stuff like that. And so they were kind of dotted around. And so the Estonians are like, fuck it. And we don't want to fuck with Russia at all. Like, the Setos literally live like on the border of Russia. Like, a lot of their shit nowadays, a lot of their important shit is in Russia. And so, yeah, they were pretty much able to avoid Estonification just as a whole. And so in 1920s, the Setos were brought into Estonia, but after World War II, the country was annexed by the Soviet Union. So Estonia was the whole country, not just the place where the Setos lived. The whole country was annexed by the Soviet Union. And so, yeah, this 1920 thing, it was called like the Peace Treaty of Tatar. I don't remember how you pronounce it, but it was basically like, all right, these Setos, who really gives a shit? We just just give them to Estonia, and any Setos who remained in Russia, they pretty much went over to Estonia. At this point, they were like, "Fuck it, we're not living in Russia anymore. Let's go over to Estonia." Dude, this place is pretty. This place is pretty fucking gay, and the place was called Setoma, which I guess translates to Seto land. And so, yeah, they get their own land, and they get it for about 25 years, and then Russia, or I guess the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union isn't Russia, it's the Soviet Union. It's Russia, dude. Russia goes in and annexes them, annexes all of Estonia, and makes it part of the Soviet Union. And like I said, most of Estonia got Sovietized. They're mostly atheists now. They have like that cold, dead, like Eastern European look in their eyes, shit like that. But the Setos, you look up these people, they're a little bit more lively. They do have a little bit of like that Slavic stoicness to them, but they're a little bit more lively. They dress a little bit more fun. They're having a little bit more fun than the Estonians who were Sovietized. And so, due to their rurality and strong oral traditions, like most of their shit was oral. Like they had a ton of songs and stuff like that, and the songs were about their traditions, like the laws, the stories, the religion. A lot of that shit was oral, and so it's like you can't if like if if they were like preaching from the Bible or whatever, the Soviets could have been like, all right, well, we're just gonna burn all your Bibles. Um, but in order for them to like stop them, in order for the Soviets to stop the Setos from doing their tradition, it's like you got to kill all of them, which I don't think the Soviet Union was necessarily like morally opposed to doing that, but I think it was so hard because of the Setos, just like how rural they lived and how like separated and stuff they were, that they couldn't get Sovietized. So yeah, they were pretty much able to avoid Sovietization and Estonification. So they survived a couple waves. I don't give them as much credit for the Estonification. Like I said, if you get got by Estonia, man, like can you imagine getting got by Estonia? Yeah, my people, we got genocided by the Estonians. God, God, that would be like I said, the British, the Americans, the Chinese, like the Japanese. If the Japanese genocide you, a lot of these other people, I'm a little bit more like okay, you got by some of the greats, but the Estonians, the Estonians genocided you. Really, they were the ones that got you, and so they were able to avoid a couple waves of that bullshit. Which this is, it makes them one of like the only like pretty much non-westernized or non-Russified groups in Europe. I think that's kind of what they mean when they say that they're an indigenous group. It's that they haven't been Russified or like westernized pretty much at all. They haven't really been got by any of that. They are Christian, but they're like this weird form of Orthodox Christianity that has strong ties to like their native or traditional like shamanistic animistic beliefs and stuff like that. I think that's what they mean when they say that they were um an indigenous at the very like an indigenous culture. I think that's kind of what they're getting at there, which is very rare in Europe because everyone always talks about how Europe conquered, Africa and South America and Australia, and they did. Europeans did go out and do that, genocided a lot of them, also kind of made a lot of their lives better. I don't think that's exactly a fair trade off. I'm not saying that's a fair trade off, but they did good and bad throughout the world. But people forget, in order for them to have went and done that, they kind of have to do it first where they live. If that like you can't have a bunch of bullshit at home and then go out and like colonize, like South Africa or whatever. It's pretty hard to do that. You kind of have to pacify and like nationalize everybody in your country before you go out and start trying to do that to other places, other, tribes, states, nations, whatever. So that's a big thing that that's why there's no indigenous groups in Europe, or not a ton of indigenous groups in Europe, if that makes sense. Like there are genetically, like, yes, these people have a right to the land and all that bullshit, but like culturally, there's not a ton of um indigenous shit in Europe, if that makes sense. Which once again, I don't know if I necessarily like think that's a bad thing. I think Europe has done pretty well. Hate them now. Despise the despise the Europeans now. Really don't like any of them. Um, but yeah, they're just not. They just don't have a lot of old school tradition. I don't know if that. I don't know. I'm not here to fucking debate the term indigenous or whatever. It's just that this was one of the only groups who didn't get conquered or westernized or nationalized really by the country that they live in, which is pretty unique for Europe. Pretty unique. And so this is a fun thing that we're going to talk about here. So the Seto Lilo is a style of polyphonic folk singing, which is performed primarily by women. And so it's pretty sick to listen to. I tried to look it up on Spotify, but the only way you can like hear the music is by watching like 480p YouTube videos, which I think is actually pretty it it lends itself to being more authentic. It's like it's just like someone smuggled in an old like Motorola phone and recorded these people singing, and that's like the only evidence of the Seto Lilo or the Seto Lilo. But basically, there's this one thing that they do. It's called like the Kingdom of Seto Day. I think that's what it's called, and it's when all like the different villages and shit get together and they all like do a whole bunch of shit. But one of the main things that they do is a Seto Lilo competition, um, and it's groups, right? Because polyphonic singing, it has something to do with like it's either like different keys or different chords or some bullshit like that. It's basically you have to have a ton of people to do it. Um, and so all these different Seto groups do it, and whoever wins it, the leader of that group gets the title the Mother of Song, which I think is pretty sick name. And so after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Seto culture saw a revival, including large gatherings and a return to their traditional religion. Like I said, a lot of that shit survived anyway, but they couldn't. It, like a lot of the religion in these countries that got taken over by the Soviet Union, they were still religious, but they had to practice it like in their houses and stuff like that. Like they couldn't go out and do it in public, so they were still religious. Like they weren't atheists or whatever. A lot of people did become atheists, but a lot of people were just like, no, I'm not. I believe in God, dummy. Like, God is the ultimate guy. I'm not listening to you over God. And so they kept practicing, but they did it more so in private, oral tradition, stuff like that. And so, unfortunately, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Setoland was divided with the Pskovo Pochersky Monastery now being on the Russian side. And so, this place, the Pskovo, I'm just going to call it the fucking Pskovo, this monastery, that's like the hub of their religion. You know what I mean? Orthodoxy is a lot more splintered than Catholicism. Um, they don't have like a they don't have a Vatican City. So essentially every like group of Orthodox people kind of have their own Vatican City, and this is essentially their Vatican City. They're a lot like the Catholic Church, the monastery. They own a lot of the land. They own basically all the churches that the Seto go to and stuff like that. But now it's on the Russian side, and this thing does look pretty sick. It's pretty similar to what you'd imagine of like the old Orthodox churches and stuff like that, like the Russian Orthodox churches with like the little onion hats they have on top and like the bright colors and all that stuff. It's actually pretty cool looking. But it is now on the Russian side after the fall of the Soviet Union. But most of the Setos still live on the Estonian side. There's about, I think, 13,000 of these boys hanging around. So a lot more than the Selk'nam, but still not a ton. And I don't know if they were ever like a super large group. Same goes with the Selk'nam. And but the Setos at least are practicing their culture, and they're more like they have more like direct lineage back to it. Whereas the Selk'nam, every Selk'nam alive today has at least some like European or just Hispanic heritage, as opposed to just pure Selk'nam heritage. But the Seto's a little bit different than that. So the Seto story ends a little bit happier. The monastery's still on the Russian side, but they're so fucking close, and they're all the way up there. I'm sure. I'm sure it's not that bad. You know what I mean? It's not that bad, and they have like this really cool. Like I said, they're kind of going back to practicing some of their traditional shit while still remaining orthodox. Which I don't know how that works, to be honest with you, but they're doing it. Yeah, and they have a lot of cool shit that they're doing. Very typical of what you'd think of like a European shaman type of thing. You know what I mean? Like druids and shit like that. Like that's kind of their thing. Praying to nature spirits. Sick. All right, that's all I got for this episode. Nice little double feature. Double feature of the Selk'nam and the Setos. Two pretty different groups altogether. You know what I mean? Not in terms of geographic range, which is different, but in terms of culture and stuff like that. Very different groups, very different outcomes. Somehow the Setos were able to hang on despite attempts to Estonify, Sovietize, and I'm sure Rusify as well. They survived all that shit. Selk'nam, they were just straight up hunted to extinction. Like with the Setos, at least there was like they just weren't like genocided outright. Like they tried to forcefully assimilate them at the very least. Whereas the Selk'nam, they didn't really stand a chance, like at all. They didn't have. They couldn't like hide in the woods and shit. Like there's no woods down there. They couldn't fucking hide at all. So sucks for them, but allegedly there's still a few of them around. Wish you guys all the best. I hope you guys have a good one. I'm talking to the Selk'nam there. But to the people listening to this, I hope you have a good day, a good week, a good year, a good life, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Ping.